It was 4:17 in the morning on October 3rd, 1945, and Corporal James Whitfield of the British Royal Army Medical Corps was carrying a newborn baby through the corridor of the women's ward at Changi Detention Facility in Singapore when he passed the room where the baby's mother was lying and heard, through the door, the sound of a woman trying very hard not to make noise while she was crying. Whitfield stopped walking. He looked down at the infant in his arms. A girl, 7 pounds 4 ounces, born 43 minutes earlier to a 28-year-old Japanese woman named Tomoko Ishida, who had been in British custody for 3 weeks and who had arrived at Changi in the late stages of pregnancy with a specific combination of physical exhaustion and psychological containment that the women who came through the facility's intake process all carried in varying degrees. The baby was healthy. Whitfield had checked everything that could be checked in the 43 minutes since the birth. The baby was pink and breathing and producing the specific quality of sound that healthy newborns produce, and the medical assessment of the situation was straightforward. The situation itself was not straightforward. Whitfield had been told by the facility's medical officer to take the infant to the nursery that the British administration had established in a converted storeroom at the corridor's far end. A room equipped with the basic provisions for newborn care that the Occupation Authority's medical staff had assembled with the practical urgency of people who had discovered, upon arriving at Changi, that the facility contained several pregnant Japanese women and that the occupation's administrative planning had not fully addressed this specific contingency. The nursery was warm. It was clean. It had what a newborn needed in the first hours of life. What the nursery did not have was Tomoko Ishida. Whitfield stood in the corridor for a moment that was longer than the medical logistics of the situation required. Then he turned around and walked back to Tomoko Ishida's room and knocked on the door, and, when there was no response, opened it and brought the baby in and placed her in her mother's arms. He had not been instructed to do this. He had, technically, been instructed not to do this. And the decision he made in that corridor at 4:17 in the morning of October 3rd, 1945 would, in the 72 hours that followed, become the instrument of the most significant revision in Tomoko Ishida's understanding of who her captors were and what they intended for her and her daughter. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. To understand what Tomoko Ishida had believed was happening when the British medical officer had initially indicated that the infant would be taken to the nursery, one must understand the specific ideological portrait of the British enemy that her formation had provided and the specific context that a Japanese woman in British custody in October 1945 would have brought to the interpretation of any action that separated her from her newborn child. Tomoko Ishida had been the wife of a Japanese colonial administrative officer stationed in Singapore through the war years. A civilian whose presence in Singapore had been the consequence of her husband's assignment rather than any military role of her own, and who had found herself, at the war's ending, in the specific category of Japanese civilian in former British colonial territory that the repatriation machinery of the occupation had not yet processed with sufficient speed to prevent her from giving birth in British custody. She was educated, had studied at a women's college in Osaka before the war, and had in the pre-war period read enough English literature and translation to have formed some impression of British culture that was more textured than the wartime propaganda portrait allowed. But the propaganda portrait had been maintained alongside that impression for 4 years with the institutional thoroughness of a state at war, and by October 1945 the portrait had accumulated enough emotional weight that the more textured pre-war impression had difficulty asserting itself against it. The portrait said the British were colonial administrators whose relationship to the Asian peoples under their authority had been organized, across the preceding century, around the specific logic of racial hierarchy that British imperial culture had developed and maintained and defended through exactly the kind of institutional thoroughness that wartime Japanese ideology had now turned back upon its originators. This was not entirely a fabricated portrait. British colonial administration in Singapore and Malaya had been organized around racial and cultural hierarchies that the historical record documented with a specificity that the portrait's wartime amplification did not need to invent. What the portrait had done was take the documented worst of British colonial practice and project it forward as the inevitable logic of British behavior toward Japanese prisoners. The assumption that the racial contempt that had organized British colonial administration toward Asian populations would organize British military administration toward Japanese prisoners with the same logic and the same consequences. The removal of a newborn infant from a Japanese prisoner in a British facility was, within this framework, immediately and entirely explicable as an expression of exactly the logic the portrait had predicted. A British officer taking a Japanese infant from its Japanese mother did not need to explain himself in the portrait's interpretive framework. He was doing what the portrait had said British officers in positions of authority over Japanese prisoners would do, asserting the institutional logic of an occupying power over the most vulnerable possible subject at the most vulnerable possible moment, as a demonstration of authority whose specific content was less important than its function as a statement of the power relationship between captor and captive. This was what Tomoko Ishida believed was happening when a medical officer indicated the infant would be taken to the nursery. She believed it with the specific, bodily certainty of a woman who has just given birth and whose infant is being carried away by a man in a uniform belonging to the enemy her formation had told her regarded her, and everything she was is subject to exactly this kind of authority. She did not say anything. She had been in British custody for 3 weeks and had developed the specific management of response that captivity in the presence of uncertain authority produces, the containment of the visible self to the minimum that the situation required, the suppression of the reaction whose expression might invite consequences whose character she could not predict. She did not say anything. She tried not to make noise while she was crying, and she lay in a room at Changi waiting to understand what the removal of her daughter meant for what came next. What came next was Corporal James Whitfield knocking on her door. The return of the infant to its mother's arms was not, in the medical logic that Whitfield's training had given him, a complicated clinical decision. A newborn in the first hours of life benefits from contact with its mother. A mother in the first hours after birth benefits from contact with her infant. The medical literature on this point was not ambiguous. The facility's nursery had been established as a contingency for situations where the medical condition of the mother or the infant required their separation for clinical reasons. Tomoko Ishida's medical condition did not require separation. Her infant's medical condition did not require separation. The reason the infant had been taken to the nursery was administrative convenience rather than clinical necessity, and administrative convenience was not, in Whitfield's assessment of the situation, a sufficient reason to leave a new mother in a room without her newborn child at 4 in the morning. He brought the baby back. He helped Tomoko Ishida with the initial feeding, communicating through gesture and the specific practical physical guidance that this kind of assistance does not require language to provide. He checked the infant's vital signs again. He made the clinical notes that the situation required. And then he said something in English that Tomoko Ishida did not understand and that the tone of his voice communicated as something in the register of reassurance before he left the room. She lay in the room with her daughter through the remainder of that night, processing what had happened in the interpretive framework that was available to her. The framework was the portrait. The portrait had not predicted this. The portrait had predicted removal, had provided, in the interpretive vocabulary of 4 years of wartime ideology, a clear and coherent account of what a British officer taking a Japanese infant from its mother meant and why it was happening. The portrait had not provided an account of what a British officer returning a Japanese infant to its mother at 4 in the morning meant. The action did not fit the framework. The framework was the only interpretive tool she had, and the action that did not fit it had happened, concretely and physically, in the presence of her own body and her daughter's body and the hands of a corporal from the British Royal Army Medical Corps who had knocked on her door and brought the baby back. The 72 hours that followed were not dramatic. They were the ordinary medical hours of a woman recovering from childbirth in a facility whose medical staff understood what recovery from childbirth required and provided it. The food at regular intervals, the clinical assessments, the practical assistance with the infant's care that the nursing staff extended with the professional matter-of-factness of people doing their jobs and the way their training had shaped those jobs to be done. Whitfield appeared for his shifts and checked on Tomoko Ishida and the infant with the regularity of a medical routine that did not distinguish between patients on the basis of the national category they occupied within the facility's administrative classification. The other nursing staff, a mix of British military medical personnel and civilian nurses who had remained in Singapore through the occupation's early weeks, operated in the same register of professional attention to clinical need rather than administrative category. What accumulated through those 72 hours was not a dramatic revision of the portrait. It was the progressive loss of the portrait's explanatory power, the gradual, evidence-driven process by which an interpretive framework that cannot account for the evidence it is encountering loses its authority over the interpretation of that evidence. Whitfield had brought the baby back. The nursing staff fed her and checked her and helped her with the infant. The food was adequate. The clinical attention was genuine, and none of it corresponded to the account of British behavior toward Japanese prisoners that the portrait had provided with such institutional authority across the preceding 4 years. On the morning of the 72nd hour, the morning of October 6, 1945, when Tomoko Ishida was sitting up in the facility bed feeding her daughter in the specific absorbed quiet of the nursing relationship, Whitfield appeared for his morning round and said something, and Tomoko Ishida did not understand the words, but understood the tone and understood the gesture when he indicated the infant with a nod that carried in it the specific human acknowledgement of something that was going well. She looked at him for a moment that was longer than the clinical exchange required, and then she said, in Japanese, something that the interpreter who was called in later translated as approximately, "I thought you were going to take her away permanently. I did not understand why you brought her back." Whitfield heard the translation. He was 24 years old and from Coventry and had joined the RAMC in 1942 and had spent 3 years doing the work that medical corps personnel do in the specific institutional context that war provides, and he had not thought of himself, at 4:17 in the morning of October 3rd, as making a decision that would matter to anyone beyond the medical assessment that had produced it. He had brought the baby back because the baby's mother was in the next room and there was no clinical reason for the separation, and it was 4 in the morning and the woman was crying. He did not know what to say to the translation. He said, through the interpreter, that the baby belonged with her mother. That was the clinical assessment. That was the reason he had brought her back. Tomoko Ishida looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at her daughter. And the portrait, the four-year construction of wartime ideology, the accumulated institutional authority of a framework that had organized her understanding of what the enemy was and what the enemy intended, lost in that moment the specific claim it had been making since October 3rd. Not all of its claims, not all at once, but the specific claim about the infant. The specific prediction that the removal had confirmed and the return had contradicted. The framework had predicted one thing. The evidence had provided another. And the evidence was her daughter, in her arms, in a facility where the medical corporal had brought her back at 4 in the morning because the baby's mother was in the next room, and there was no clinical reason for the separation. Freedom takes care of the most vulnerable thing in the room, not because a regulation requires it, though the regulation may align with it, not because an ideology prescribes it, though the ideology may include it, but because the person doing the work has internalized, through the training and the culture and the specific formation of a civilization organized around the value of the individual, that the most vulnerable thing in the room deserves the care that its vulnerability requires. Whitfield brought the baby back because that was what the situation required, and because the situation was a mother and an infant and the medical assessment was clear. That was all. That was enough. And 72 hours later, in a room in Changi where the portrait had finally run out of explanatory power, it was more than enough. It was the argument that all the ideology in the world had not been able to make. The argument that arrived not in language, but in the weight of an infant placed in a mother's arms at 4 in the morning by a man from Coventry who had simply decided that the baby belonged there. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. Tomoko Ishida and her daughter, and Corporal James Whitfield deserve to be remembered. We found them.